The year is 284 AD. A Roman soldier is holding his monthly pay in his hand. Same coin as always, same face of the emperor stamped into the metal, same size, same weight. He's seen this coin his whole life, but something feels off. He scratches the surface with his thumbnail, and the silver flakes away. Underneath it, cheap bronze. He just got paid in a lie. 25 years bleeding on the northern frontier, 25 years holding the line against Germanic tribes in temperatures that froze the Rhine solid. And his life savings, every coin he'd set aside for retirement, for his family, for the farm he was going to buy, had been quietly, systematically hollowed out. Not by an enemy, by his own emperor, by his own government, by the money itself. That soldier's story is not an ancient footnote. It is a pattern. And that pattern has repeated itself in every major civilization that has ever tried to solve a fiscal crisis by manipulating its currency. What most people know about Rome's fall is the barbarians at the gates version, the dramatic cinematic collapse, Visigoths sacking the city, the last emperor deposed, the lights going out on Western civilization. What most people don't know is that Rome's economy was already dying decades before a single Germanic king sat on a Roman throne. And here is what makes this history genuinely dangerous to ignore. While the majority of Romans, 70 million people, watched 5 centuries of civilization dissolve in a single generation, a specific group of families came through that collapse not just intact, but in some cases wealthier than they had entered it. They weren't lucky. They weren't corrupt insiders with advance warning. They held 4 specific assets, 4 things that not only preserved value through one of history's most complete economic catastrophes, they actively transferred wealth toward the people who held them and away from everyone else. One of those 4 assets is something that every mainstream financial advisor working today would call reckless, irresponsible, and financially dangerous. The Romans who held it didn't just survive the fall, they profited from it. Before we get to what survived, you need to understand what killed the Roman economy. Because this is where the modern parallel becomes uncomfortable. Rome didn't die from barbarians first. It died from its money first. The denarius was Rome's silver coin, the economic heartbeat of an empire stretching from the Scottish highlands to the Syrian desert. Under Emperor Augustus, at the empire's height, it was struck at nearly 95% pure silver. Every legionnaire's salary, every merchant's profit margin, every farmer's life savings was denominated in that coin. It wasn't just currency, it was confidence in portable, verifiable form. Then the bills arrived, running a frontier empire against simultaneous military pressure from Germanic tribes pushing south from the Rhine, and the resurgent Persian Empire pressing from the east required money that no tax system on earth could generate fast enough. Infrastructure was crumbling. Plague was reducing the tax base. Military pay was falling behind. And the emperors did what governments across all of recorded history have done when obligations outpace revenue. They cheated the money. Under Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius had already fallen to roughly 50%. The coins looked identical. Same imperial seal, same nominal value. But half the silver had been quietly replaced with bronze. Merchants noticed. They always do. By the mid-3rd century, under Emperor Gallienus, a man who faced 23 rival claimants to his throne in just 15 years, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. Scratch the surface and the cheap metal showed through. What followed was textbook. Prices exploded. Merchants refused debased coins for imported goods. Soldiers demanded raises to compensate for wages that bought less every month. Farmers abandoned their land rather than accept worthless money in exchange for grain that cost real labor to grow. The trade network that had bound 70 million people together began fracturing at every seam simultaneously. Between 235 and 284 AD, the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome suffered military collapse, devastating plague, cascading civil war, and economic implosion at the same time. Nearly 50 emperors in 50 years, most of them murdered within months of taking power. The empire that had stood for 5 centuries was coming apart. And into that catastrophe, 4 assets held their ground. The first is gold, but not in the way you've been told. Everyone knows gold survived Rome's fall. That part of the story is accurate. But the version most people hear is dangerously incomplete. And the gap in that story has cost people real money in every collapse since. Here is the full picture. When Constantine the Great consolidated power in the early 4th century, he introduced a new gold coin called the solidus, 24-karat gold, 4.5 grams, struck with consistent purity and precise weight across every imperial mint. No debasement, no silver wash. No political games played with the metal content. The market responded immediately. Merchants who had been conducting major transactions in grain and raw silk because nobody trusted the denarius suddenly had a reliable medium of exchange again. The solidus became the currency of the wealthy and the internationally connected, anyone who needed to do serious business across political boundaries. For the next 7 centuries, long after Rome's western half had dissolved into competing Germanic kingdoms, the solidus remained the backbone of Mediterranean commerce. Byzantine merchants were still trading in it in the 11th century. Think about that. A Roman senator who held his wealth in debased denarii in 300 AD was financially destroyed within a generation. The senator who had converted that position into gold, specifically into gold of verified, consistent purity, maintained his economic standing through the worst of the collapse. But here is the layer that almost never makes it into the standard account. Not all gold was equal. The underground market for gold in 3rd century Rome was chaotic. Clipped coins, adulterated bars, fraudulent weights. It was everywhere. The families who survived weren't simply those who held gold. They were those who held gold that could be independently verified, weighed, tested, and trusted by a counterparty in a direct transaction without needing any institutional guarantee to back it up. The wealthy classes increasingly demanded payment in aurum, pure gold by weight, rather than any specific coin denomination. They had internalized the core lesson that every collapse eventually teaches. The coin is a political instrument. It is subject to the priorities, the pressures, and the desperation of whoever controls the mint. The metal itself is the store of value. That distinction between the asset and the paper claim on the asset is not a uniquely Roman problem. It is the permanent condition of any monetary system operating under stress. Rome didn't teach us that gold is safe. Rome taught us that what cannot be diluted cannot be debased. And right now, every major central bank on earth is running a monetary experiment with no historical precedent. The U.S. money supply expanded by over 40% between 2020 and 2023. The Romans called what they were doing debasement. We call it quantitative easing. The words are different. The math is identical. Now, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now. The Recession Warnings community spans dozens of countries, and I want to know where you're tuning in from. The second asset is the one that will make you stop and rewind this video, because it breaks every instinct you have about financial safety. It is debt. And I need you to stay with me here, because this is the insight that permanently reshapes how you read the history of money and how you think about your own financial position today. During Rome's hyperinflation, being a debtor was an advantage. Here is exactly what that means in concrete terms. A Roman landowner takes out a loan of 100,000 denarii in 200 AD. At that moment, those 100,000 denarii represent a genuine fortune, enough to acquire a productive agricultural estate outside the city. Real land, real productive capacity, purchased with borrowed money denominated in the currency of the day. By 280 AD, 100,000 denarii buys approximately what a few sacks of grain cost in 200 AD. The silver content of the denarius had collapsed by over 90%. Prices had risen in lockstep. But the loan was still denominated in nominal denarii. The contract said 100,000 denarii, and 100,000 denarii is what got repaid. Except those 100,000 denarii in 280 AD represented a tiny fraction of the purchasing power they carried when the debt was created. The borrower repaid a fortune with money that was functionally worthless. The lender, whoever had extended credit in solid silver-heavy denarii, received back bronze coins with a silver wash. Inflation didn't just erode the currency, it systematically transferred wealth from creditors to debtors on a massive empire-wide scale. Every fixed debt obligation denominated in nominal denarii became progressively cheaper to repay in real terms as the currency collapsed. The borrower's land remained. The debt's purchasing power did not. Roman historians document this pattern in the behavior of the senatorial class throughout the crisis. Those who had leveraged their land holdings with debt in the 2nd century found themselves by the late 3rd century holding enormous real assets, productive farmland, urban properties, grain warehouses, while their debt obligations had been inflated to near nothing. The great landed families maintained extraordinary economic power even through the empire's final collapse. They weren't just surviving. Some were negotiating political arrangements with Visigothic and Frankish leaders from positions of genuine strength. Their debtor's advantage had given them something more valuable than liquid savings. It had given them real assets, completely unencumbered by obligations that once seemed crushing. This pattern did not begin with Rome. The Weimar hyperinflation of 1923 produced the identical dynamic. German industrialists who had borrowed heavily to build manufacturing capacity paid off those loans in marks worth less than the paper they were printed on. They emerged owning real capital free and clear, while their creditors, the savers, the bondholders, the retirees on fixed incomes, were economically annihilated. Inflation is not simply a tax on savings. It is a wealth transfer mechanism. And in every instance across recorded history, the direction of that transfer has run the same way. away from those who hold paper claims, toward those who hold real assets funded by debt in the collapsing currency. The Romans had no academic framework for this principle, but the families who understood it, whether by intuition, calculation, or hard experience, came through the fall of an empire with their positions intact, sometimes strengthened. The third asset challenges something even deeper than your views on debt or gold. Because most people who study Rome's collapse walk away thinking land is the answer. Buy land, hold land, land always wins. And they are half right. Land alone did not save you. This is the critical distinction that every simplified version of this story misses completely. And it is the distinction that determines whether the same principle applies to your situation today or not. Rome at its height was a deeply interconnected economy. Spanish olive oil shipped to Britain, Egyptian grain feeding the capital, Syrian purple dye clothing senators. The complexity of that supply chain was extraordinary for the ancient world. And when it fractured completely and without warning. A landowner whose estate depended on that trade network, who grew cash crops for export, who relied on imported tools, who needed urban markets to purchase his surplus, found himself stranded when the network stopped functioning. The supply chains that had made his land valuable vanished overnight. The markets that had purchased his crops disappeared. His land was physically still there. Its economic function was gone. The estates that survived were built on an entirely different logic. The self-sufficient Roman villa wasn't simply a farm, it was a closed-loop economy. Grain, vegetables, meat, timber, wool, leather, basic metalwork, all produced internally. The estate maintained its own smiths, its own carpenters, its own physicians for the laborers who worked it, pottery fired in estate kilns, cloth woven by estate workers. When the trade networks that had connected the empire contracted and eventually snapped, the self-sufficient villa didn't need them. It had never fully depended on them. Historical examination of the late Roman period shows that the great villa estates of Britain, Gaul, and North Africa actually expanded their self-sufficiency infrastructure throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries, adding industrial workshops, enlarging grain storage, diversifying their agricultural output, precisely as the broader imperial economy was contracting around them. These were deliberate strategic decisions. The owners of these estates understood what the evidence was telling them. Complexity was becoming a liability. Self-sufficiency was the only hedge that couldn't be inflated away, couldn't be taxed into irrelevance, and couldn't be disrupted by a trade route that no longer existed. There's another dimension to this that deserves its own moment. The self-sufficient estate didn't just survive economically, it became a center of local political authority as the state progressively withdrew. When Roman tax collectors stopped appearing, when the legions disbanded for want of pay, when the roads became dangerous and local administration collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction, the large villa owner filled the vacuum. He provided physical security, he provided food, he provided stable employment and predictable social order. He became functionally a local sovereign, the one constant in a landscape of dissolving institutions. The social relationships that crystallized around the great villa estates in the post-Roman period became the template for what eventually evolved into medieval feudalism. The landowners who had diversified away from imperial dependency and built internal productive capacity didn't just hold their wealth through the collapse. They became the structural foundation of the next political order. That is not merely survival. That is what it looks like when an asset doesn't just endure a collapse. It defines what comes after it. Now think about what the modern equivalent of that principle looks like. It is not about owning a Roman villa. It is about the degree to which your economic position depends on complex systems that you do not control and cannot repair. Every supply chain disruption since 2020 has been a live demonstration of exactly this vulnerability. The businesses and individuals who struggled most were those whose operations had the most external dependencies, those who had built redundancy, local sourcing, and operational self-sufficiency, in whatever form that took for their specific context, were the ones who kept functioning. Rome is not teaching us to become medieval farmers. Rome is teaching us that in a high complexity, highly interconnected system, the nodes with the fewest external dependencies are the last ones standing when the network fails. The fourth asset is the one that requires no capital, no land, and no debt. It requires only one thing, and it is the thing that the Roman collapse revealed with absolute clarity about what human economic value actually is when you strip away every institutional layer. It is the irreplaceable skill. Here's the sorting mechanism that every economic collapse applies without mercy or exception. Your credential doesn't matter when the institution that issued it no longer functions. Your professional title doesn't matter when the organization that gave it authority has dissolved. Your savings don't matter when the currency they're denominated in has been debased into irrelevance. What Rome's fall revealed, and what every subsequent collapse has confirmed across every culture and every century since, is that only two categories of human capability maintain genuine exchange value when currencies fail and supply chains dissolve. The first is the skill that addresses an immediate, unavoidable human need. The physician who can treat infection without imported medicines from the eastern trade routes. The blacksmith who can forge a plow blade from scrap iron. The miller who can turn grain into flour with nothing but stone and leverage. The carpenter who can repair a roof before the winter rains arrive. These people could eat in Rome's darkest years, not because they held gold or land or clever debt arrangements, because what they produced could not be withheld, could not be inflated away, and could not be replaced by any political decree. A farmer whose plow breaks in April needs a blacksmith that week. That need exists whether the denarius is worth a gram of silver or a gram of bronze. Whether the emperor on the coin has been assassinated or simply fled. The second is the skill that enables commerce across collapsing boundaries. Rome's disintegration didn't eliminate all trade. It fragmented it. And in a fragmented landscape, the merchant who could operate across multiple competing political units, speaking multiple languages, maintaining trusted relationships in multiple jurisdictions, moving goods across borders that kept shifting as Germanic kingdoms carved up former Roman territory, was worth his weight in the gold coins he traded in. Certain trading networks, particularly those connecting the eastern Mediterranean ports, maintained activity well into the post-Roman centuries, not at Roman scale, but functioning. The operators of those networks were not Roman citizens, in any meaningful political sense by the time the Western Empire formally ended. They were traders with skills, relationships, and a portable stock of trusted hard currency. The state had dissolved around them. Their economic function had not. What happened to the Roman professionals whose value was purely institutional? The lawyers whose practice depended on Roman civil law courts that ceased to function? The imperial administrators whose salaries came from a treasury that went bankrupt? The military logistics officers whose entire expertise was premised on an army that disbanded when it couldn't be paid? They struggled, not universally. Some adapted and repurposed their knowledge. But the collapse exposed the fragility at the core of credential-based economic identity with devastating clarity. Your value in a failing system is only as durable as the system itself. The craftsman, the physician, the merchant, with a portable skill set, these were the people who didn't just survive Rome's fall. They were the ones who trained the children of the aristocrats who survived, who serviced the villas that became feudal estates, who carried the practical technical knowledge of Roman civilization forward through the centuries we call the Dark Ages, which were dark partly because so much institutional knowledge evaporated while craft knowledge survived. The analysis of collapsing societies across history identifies this with precision. Complex societies maintain specialists whose entire economic function depends on maintaining that complexity. When complexity collapses, those specialists become redundant. The skills that survive are invariably those that function at lower levels of complexity. Skills that work when supply chains have broken, when institutions have failed, when the state has fragmented into local strongmen and shifting territorial boundaries. Rome didn't preserve its legal system through the fall. It didn't preserve its administrative architecture or its financial sophistication. What it preserved, imperfectly but genuinely, were its carpenters, its physicians, its grain farmers, and its metalworkers. The people who could do the irreducible things that kept human beings alive regardless of who held political power. So here is what these 4 Roman assets reveal about the permanent mechanics of economic collapse, and why this is not a history lesson. It is a current events briefing with a 1,700-year head start. Gold survived, but only the gold you could verify, weigh, and use in a direct transaction without institutional intermediaries. The paper claim on gold evaporated, the metal endured. Today, there are more paper claims on gold than there is physical gold to back them. That ratio has never been wider in recorded history. Debt in a collapsing currency survived, not as a burden, but as a hidden mechanism for transferring real wealth from those who lend to those who borrow. The Roman families, who held real assets purchased with loans denominated in debased denarii, came through one of history's most complete economic catastrophes, with their positions intact. In an era of persistent inflation and record sovereign debt levels globally, the direction of that transfer is already running. Self-sufficient, low-dependency assets survived, but only those that had deliberately severed reliance on the complexity surrounding them. The villa estate that could feed, clothe, and shelter its people without reference to trade networks or imperial supply chains didn't just endure the collapse. It became the nucleus of what came after. Ask yourself honestly, how many layers of complex, fragile, externally dependent systems stand between you and your basic economic needs? And irreplaceable skills survived. The capabilities that address fundamental human needs when everything else has failed. The portable knowledge that no political collapse can confiscate, no inflation can erode, and no invading administration can make obsolete. These 4 things share one principle that Rome taught with blood and with bronze coins wearing a thin silver mask. What survives a collapse is not what the system values most during prosperity. What survives is what cannot be faked, cannot be diluted, and cannot be made redundant when the system itself is gone. Rome's emperors believed they could solve a fiscal crisis by striking more coins from cheaper metal. They believed a coin that looked like silver was functionally equivalent to silver. They believed the complexity and scale of their empire was proof of its permanence. The complexity was the vulnerability. The scale made the unraveling faster, not slower. The United States currently carries over $34 trillion in national debt. The Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet by trillions in less than a decade. Every major global currency is backed by nothing except the credibility of the government that issues it and the willingness of the people who hold it to keep believing. Rome fell slowly, then all at once. The pattern isn't new, the timeline is. If this video changed how you think about money, about what holds value, about what the survivors of history's greatest collapses actually held, subscribe to Recession Warnings right now. Every video on this channel is built around one question. When the next collapse comes, and history says it will, what do you want to be holding? Hit subscribe. And share this video with one person in your life who you think needs to hear it. Because the most valuable thing you can do right now isn't buying gold or paying off debt. It's understanding the pattern before it completes itself. The Romans didn't get a warning, you just got one.